The Canadian government has paused its zero emission vehicle mandate. Now, what this was brought in by the Trudeau government, and it required 20% of all new light duty vehicles to be zero emission by 2026, 60% by 2030, and 100% by 2035. Now, the auto sector has hated this from the very beginning. This is a stick, and the $7,500 federal rebate was a carrot. And what the auto industry wanted was more carrots. Didn't want any stick. They didn't like being beaten with a stick. But here's the problem. The reason we did this right from the very beginning was to decarbonize the transportation sector to meet climate targets under the Paris Agreement. Now that might be okay. That's fine. The problem is that ever since Donald Trump became president in January, the climate has slid way down the list of concerns for Canadians. It's, there's Trump and there's housing and affordability and the drug crisis and so on. They've all overtaken the climate. So if you want to design a policy justifying it by pointing to the climate crisis, it's not going to do it. They're not going to get the public support for it. And coincidentally, after the government announced the pause, my inbox was full of press releases from the various climate agencies and environmental groups complaining about, the mandate being paused for this very reason. So here's what I want to suggest: a different approach. And I'm going to quote Kevin Byrne, one of my favorite economists. He works for S&P Global, and I've been interviewing for 10 years about emissions and the oil sands and the oil and gas industry. And as he said in a recent interview, he said, we don't take a very strategic approach to oil and gas in Canada. We basically rip it and ship it. We do the easy thing. And his observation about our approach to oil and gas applies to autos, applies to a lot of things. We don't take a strategic approach. Now, who takes a strategic approach? China. And don't give me the whole, but they got slave labor. Yeah, they got emissions and coal. That's another conversation. This is a conversation about how you approach economic policy and industrial policy. And what China did, and this is one of the reasons why it is now it just utterly dominates the whole battery manufacturing, battery supply chains, EV manufacturing, all of the supply chain. It is disrupting the global auto industry. Because 15 or 20 years ago, it said, you know what? We are not ever going to catch the West when it comes to internal combustion engine cars, because they had a fairly big auto industry at that time. But we're never going to catch and overtake the West. They're just too far advanced in that. So what? You know what we're going to do? We're going to take a strategic approach to this, and we're going to go develop electric cars. And so that's what they did. But they did it very cleverly, because they said, okay, on the one hand, we're going to put all sorts of incentives in for EV manufacturers. And at one point, there were 700 EV manufacturers in China. It was just crazy. And now there's still, 100. Now, there might be less lately because there have been some consolidation, but there was a lot. And it was just a rat race. And the fastest rats won. And so now we've had 12 or 15 of these companies kind of come to the fore, and they're now leading the industry. They said, okay, that's what we want. We want manufacturing and all of the supply chains attached to the manufacturing. How are we going to help do that is by, if that's on the supply side, we're going to also subsidize deployment of EVs in our marketplace. So they subsidized in a variety of ways, direct subsidies, and they had a license plate policy, where new energy vehicles, you could get a plate, but you couldn't for an internal combustion engine car, all sorts of cash for clunkers. There's another one, all of that kind of stuff. And so they now they buy 60% of the EVs in the world. They're the world's biggest market for EVs, and they've driven down the cost. They're technologically advanced, much further advanced, in fact, than the American, the Western model. On and on. So what they got is they are decarbonizing their transportation sector, and on top of that, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in the EV manufacturing and all of the supply chains and all of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs that came along with it. Why can't Canada do that? Not on that scale. We're a small country. We're like 40 million people. We're not 1.5 billion people. So we can't do it at that scale. We don't have to. There are EV manufacturers out there making a profit at 100,000 units a year, or a couple 100,000 units a year. We do, I think we do 2.2 million vehicle sales per year. We manufacture 1.3 million of them, right? So if we did a couple 100,000, 300,000, we'd make a dent in that, and we wouldn't have to have all of our auto manufacturing capacity switched over to EVs. That could come over time. But it would be a strategic response. Now, the federal government's paused this program for 60 days. What a great time to put this time to use and start thinking of it strategically instead of reactively. So here's what I'm suggesting is that we look all the way back to the beginning of the supply chain, which is critical minerals. And Bloomberg NEF in 2024 said that Canada had the most potential for battery supply chain out of any other country in the world, including China. Potential. But a lot of it had to do with we have all the critical minerals, lots of them, from Ontario's Ring of Fire up into northern BC, northern Alberta, Quebec. I mean, we have low-cost electricity. We have refining and smelting capacity. We got lots of experience, lots of mining companies. We're a big mining country. So refining and smelting is very important because the Chinese utterly dominate, like 90% of the capacity in the world for battery metals. So we know how to do this stuff. And we've begun making investments in Ontario and Quebec in battery plants. Volkswagen announced one, Stellantis announced one, and there were some smaller ones. So we have all of the potential pieces here to do the entire battery supply chain. Well, what about EV manufacturing? The Auto Parts Manufacturers Association, which has about 700 members, over 700 members, we are a major auto parts manufacturing country. And the APMA undertook a few years ago Project Arrow. They built a lovely electric SUV, and they toured it around the country, and it was built entirely with Canadian-made technology and parts. Entirely. We can do this. Now, we're going to have to do it at scale. It takes time to scale up, and this is why industrial policy is so important, because it puts in place subsidies, it puts in place tax breaks, it puts in place training, it puts in place all the things that need to support an industry while it's scaling out to commercialization so that it can then fly on its own. That's what China did. In fact, countries have been doing this for, over 100 years. And the Americans do it. ARPA and DARPA, ring a bell? NASA, all of the Americans do it as well. They just do it differently than everybody else. So we have not done industrial policy. We prefer to rip it and ship it, send out our raw materials, our natural resources raw. This is a problem. So what a wonderful opportunity. Take a pause, step back, and say, we're going to do things differently. And you know what? This is time to criticize Prime Minister Mark Carney. I have said many nice things about Carney since he was chosen leader of the Liberal Party and became Prime Minister back in the spring. How can you not when the guy has a PhD in economics from Oxford and the resume that he has? I mean, when you're challenged by Trump tariffs and a slowing global economy and on, who better to have than somebody like Mark Carney, leading the country? The problem is, for all of Carney's talk, what we're seeing is essentially the same basic approach that the Trudeau government has taken, and lots of other Canadian governments have taken. Reactive instead of proactive. Reactive instead of strategic. And what I'm suggesting is a basic fundamental rethink of how we do this. What do we want? Well, what we want is to add value to our resources. We want to attract investment. We want to create business opportunities. And we want highly skilled, good paying jobs. Makes sense. That's not the way we do things. We and look at Carney, the way his major projects office is lining up. It says exactly what Trudeau did. Exactly. They get a big pot of money and they say, okay, now anybody who has a project, come and put in an application. That's not what the Americans did. And later this month or early October, I'm going to have Jigger Shaw on the show, and I'm going to be asking him. He's agreed to an interview. He headed up the American government's Department of Energy loan program. It had tens of billions of dollars. And he was an evangelist. He went out and he was promoting virtual power plants and hydrogen clusters and on and on and on and on. I mean, they took a very active, proactive role. And not only did they spend, yes, they spent money. Public tax dollars got invested in this process. But more important, he did something that was absolutely brilliant. He crowded in private money. So you might spend $1 of public money, but if you bring 10 of private capital, that's, you've done a good thing here. And there was a lot of that, especially on the battery side. And they were just ramping that up when, Trump came in and dismantled most of it. So are we going to just simply react once again, like we always do? And already, look at what Carney, this is what he's talking about. A $5 billion fund with flexible terms to support businesses across affected industries. New Buy Canadian procurement rules for federal purchases. A $370 million biofuel incentive to support Canadian farmers. Enhanced employment insurance flexibility. Come on, this is what we always do. There's nothing new in here. There's no industrial policy per se in here. And there sure as hell is not a strategic approach to this problem, which is the response to Trump's tariffs and the need to basically re-engineer parts of our economy, find new trading partners, all of that stuff. So that's my suggestion. The pause is actually a good thing, despite the environmental groups and the climate groups not being very happy about it. But it's only good if we pause, take a look, and say, we need to have a different approach, a strategic approach instead of a reactive approach.